In our videos on perfect competition, we learned that perfectly competitive firms are price takers. They have no control at all over price. And they have no control over price because they are one of many firms all selling the identical good. Monopolies, on the other hand, do have control over price. They are price makers. And what that means is that they can choose their price. Now, a common misperception is that a monopolist can charge whatever they want, but that's not true. Even if you're a monopolist, you are still subject to a demand curve. So for example, if Microsoft decides, hey, we're going to raise the price, on Microsoft Word to $1 million. So if you want to use Microsoft Word, you have to pay us $1 million for that license. This is pretty much what people are going to say. Right? And that's not just because other options exist, that they're no longer a true monopoly, but it's because nobody's willing to pay that kind of money for word processing software. If Microsoft Word really was the only option out there and they did this, we'd all go back to using typewriters. So it's not true that a monopolist can charge whatever they want. They're still subject to the demand curve. So this is our first point of departure for the individual firm's demand curve in perfect competition versus monopoly. So if you recall our Mr. DARP from perfect competition, this was the firm's demand curve. They had no control over price. They just had to take that as given. The firm's demand curve for a monopoly is just the market demand curve, right? Because they are the market, right? They are the other half of the market, so the demand for their good is just the market's demand. So that means they face a downward sloping demand curve. Now, that actually has an interesting implication because for perfect competition, remember Mr. DARP, the Mr. part of Mr. DARP was that this firm's marginal revenue and their demand curve were identical. Now, that's not true for a monopoly. If a monopolist cannot price discriminate, we'll talk about that in a second, then their marginal revenue curve is always less. The marginal revenue curve is always less than their demand curve. I'm going to show you how that works out mathematically and intuitively in just a second, but first let's talk about price discrimination and what that means. Another common misperception is that price discrimination is illegal because we're used to hearing that word discriminate and thinking that's something that's illegal. But that's not really what price discrimination is. Price discrimination is charging different prices for the same good. And what we mean by the same good is that all goods have the same marginal cost. So it's defined as the same in terms of what it costs to produce. And not only is price discrimination perfectly legal, but in the real world we are surrounded by price discrimination. Good example of this, movie tickets. If you go and see a movie in the theater at 8 o'clock at night, maybe you pay $11 for that ticket. That seat doesn't change at 3 p.m., but somehow at 3 p.m., that same movie ticket only costs $6. Right? There's no difference in the marginal cost, and yet you're charged different prices depending on your willingness to pay. So if you're willing to pay more and go out on a date at a normal date night time, you pay $11, but if you're a little bit more flexible, you pay less. Coupons are also an example of charging different prices for the same good, because my bag of cheese only costs me $1.88 if I have a coupon, but maybe it costs me $2.88 without the coupon. Same good, same bag of cheese, two different prices. Another good example of this is college tuition. One of the more infamous examples of price discrimination. The seat in a classroom costs the same no matter who you are, and yet different people are charged different tuition based on any number of things, like whether they're an athlete or whether they made better grades in high school. But that seat costs the college the same thing, and yet different people are charged different prices. So there's actually different forms of price discrimination, and perfect price discrimination is one kind of price discrimination that's actually very rare. Perfect price discrimination is the ability to charge each consumer their entire willingness to pay. And you can think of perfect price discrimination as like the ultimate used car salesman. So this is the guy who, when he sees you walk through the door, he knows somehow that you are willing to pay exactly $6,947 for one car, and another person walking in interested in a different car that's identical is willing to pay $10,433. Somehow each of you end up paying exactly that amount. And it's in this situation, and only this situation, that a monopolist's demand curve would be the same as their marginal revenue curve. So let's go back then and talk about why normally a monopolist's marginal revenue is always less than their demand. So let's start with the monopolist's demand curve and work through the logic of this. So suppose this monopolist knows that if they charge a price of $90, then people would be willing to buy 10 units of this good. Now, the monopolist says, well, I'd like to sell more. Well, according to this demand curve, in order to sell more, they will have to lower their price. So let's say they have to lower their price by $1 in order to sell one more unit. Well, if we think about that 10th unit that they were selling before, how much additional revenue did they get from that 10th unit? The marginal revenue from the 10th unit was $90. But if they sell one more unit, the marginal revenue they got from that unit is only $89. And in fact, not only do they have to charge $89 to this 11th person, if they can't price discriminate, they have to charge it to these 10 people as well. So in order to sell more, a monopolist must lower their price for all possible units, not just the last one that they went to sell. If they were able to do that, right, charge $90 to these 10 people and then $89 to the 11th person, they would be a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. So let's take a break here, and in the next video I'm going to go through the math of how this works, and we're going to use a spreadsheet so we don't have to go through the math in terms of a lot of tedious calculations, but get an intuition about why the monopolist's marginal revenue curve is always less than their demand curve.